Welcome. Today I'm sharing lessons from Ezekiel 16 to 17, and chapter 16 is just full of metaphors of Israel's relationship with God. The nation is first described as an orphan, an abandoned orphan, left alone to die, but is found by God, and he nurses her back to health, and does so much for her to make her live and to make her thrive. Verses 6 to 14 describes all that God did for that nation, and brought it up as his own. But she grows up wealthy and beautiful and begins to trust in those things, in her wealth and her beauty, and starts to rely on them to get the things that she wants, which, by the way, were the things that drove her away from God. And she used the things that God gave her to make idols and turn to prostitution. She forgets that she was once a helpless, abandoned orphan who was saved by God, and ends up sacrificing her own children. That's the irony of it all, at the altar of idols that she made and worshipped. Idolatry became unsatisfying from what we saw there. And just like most sins, when you start off, like, sin is like novelty, is exciting, and after a while it becomes unsatisfying. And I thought about it as I read, like, maybe how a sin like drug addiction, how the drugs at first is satisfying, but then after a while the addicts actually hate the fact that they're doing the drugs, but they can't stop. And it seemed like something like that, because it was unsatisfying. But instead of repenting, Israel dove deeper into that sin, and went harder in idolatry, and then she goes from the verses, she goes from being a prostitute who receives gifts from her lover to being one who uses gifts to entice and keep her lovers, to show that she had gotten that desperate. In verse 49, we learn about the sin of Sodom, the sin that led to their destruction and their downfall. Now, every time we think of Sodom, we think of the sexual sins, but here God actually highlighted that pride, arrogance, and lack of care and concern for the poor and needy were their destructions. Though their sexual sins were more commonly mentioned and appear to be the reason why they were destroyed, but it shows that, or from what I gathered, those sins of pride, arrogance, and lack of concern were the root cause of the things that made them start to do those detestable acts towards God. And it made me think about it, that truly, when you start to see yourself as more than you really are, when you're arrogant, when you don't care, then you just start to just spiral downhill. And I was like, wow, who would have thunk that for Sodom and Gomorrah? And in all of this, according to God, Jerusalem was worse than Sodom, and God promised to punish her for her sins, but also to restore her fortunes in the future. The parable in verse 17, or chapter 17, referenced an eagle, and the eagle with the beautiful, powerful wings and the long feathers referenced King Nebuchadnezzar. And the shoots, the first shoot that he planted was King Jehoiakim, who surrendered and went to captivity, but was later freed and provided for by the king for the rest of his life. I've referenced that before. That's the story in 2 Kings 25. Now, it says the eagle also planted another shoot, and that was King Zedekiah. But that shoot reached out to another eagle, Egypt, and was stripped of, it was uprooted, stripped of its fruit, and withered and died. So that really just told the story of Zedekiah rebelling against, because obviously Judah at the time was supposed to be a vassal nation, but he reached out to Egypt to help him, and Nebuchadnezzar found out, and that's where all the troubles began. But God promised to plant a shoot on the mountain of Israel, which will become great. And that obviously was a reference to the Messiah and his coming kingdom. I thought that whole parable, at first I didn't understand it, and I had to get, some knowledge from more knowledgeable people than I. And it was very interesting to actually read it again and be like, oh wow, that's what this meant. Did you get it the first time? Let me know. So here, let me share my lesson from these chapters. God is a covenant, not just a covenant keeper, but a covenant expander. Now I'll tell you. Israel broke the covenant, the initial covenant between them and God. So God responded by expanding that covenant. They sinned against him and he promised to atone for their sins and cover the cost by himself. How do we know? In chapter 16, verses 59 to 63, it shows how God had a plan all along to send Jesus even from jump. Now, we've said this before, but these verses just showed it to me in a brand new way. God truly, truly loves us excessively. Like, in all of these chapters that I'm reading, I know the first thing that will jump out at you is the judgment and the destruction and the exile, but the underlying message here really is God's love. Thank you for joining me today. We'll continue tomorrow, and I look forward to sharing with you then. Have a good day.